this time.
I was at work at the Republic National Life Insurance Company, North Central Expressway, Dallas, and it was announced over the PA that the president had been shot, and the initial response of my co-workers was one of some jubilation. I mean, there was, you know, clapping to be heard and people shouting, because he was not a popular man, of course, in Texas, because he threatened the oil revenues on which the wealth of the state appeared to float. And I know that the reaction in the high school where my girlfriend was, in theory, studying at the time, was very similar. I mean, it was announced there by the headmaster, or whatever they call him, and cheering broke out fairly generally. So I ran out into the car park and jumped into my car and drove into downtown Dallas. And I parked up somewhere and approached the police cordon. And I told them I was from the Liverpool Echo, which obviously I wasn't, and I didn't have any kind of press passes or anything at all, but just because I had an English accent, they assumed I must be telling the truth, rather touchingly. And so I went through the cordon and went and had a look at, you know, to see what was going on down by the famous grassy knoll, etc.
And just now we've received reports here at Parkland that Governor Connolly was shot in the upper left chest, and the first unconfirmed reports say the president was hit in the head.
My obsession was the radio, so I went up and switched on, and one of my favorite radio stations were doing a live transmission from Dallas, Texas on the President Kennedy visit, and I thought I had heard the announcer saying that a shot had been fired, and I seem to remember saying, my God, I think President Kennedy's been assassinated.
There's only one word to describe the picture here, and that's grief, and much of it. It's official. As of just a few moments ago, the President of the United States is dead.
In Britain, Granada's nightly magazine programme broke the news to viewers in the north. But compared with the high tech of today, production methods were primitive.
There was a film segment of something, you know, witty or something. I was sitting waiting for that film to come to an end, and suddenly a floor manager sort of scrabbled across the floor, and it was coming to the end of the film. I thought, what on earth? And he thrust a piece of paper in my hand, and he said, JFK has been shot, tell them. And I said, but I said, how do I know? He said, tell them. And the floor, he said, 10 seconds, and I was absolutely stunned. I couldn't believe it.
When you walk through a storm.
The television weekend had just begun. On ITV, elsewhere in the country, the #1 pop music show.
We were doing Ready, Steady, Go in London, and suddenly it came a news flash that John F. Kennedy had been shot. And we hadn't been on yet, we were ready to go on. I mean, it just sort of gobsmacked. We went, what? Immediately I thought, oh, World War III. He's been shot by the Russians. H-bombs, we are dead. And the guy came in and said, come on, you're on, Jerry, to do Walk Alone. And I said, you know, Kennedy's been shot. Yes, he said, but get on, you've got to do Walk Alone. And I went on the stage and thought, this might be the last time I ever sing on telly.
BBC Television, the time is 7:05.
The news of the assassination attempt came through in the middle of the Tonight programme. Cliff Mitchell-Moore gave the news, and then Tonight closed down. This was the night of the BAFTA Awards, and the whole of the television industry was at the Dorchester Hotel celebrating the awards.
We were going to collect an award for the first series of that week, that was. And I remember I heard it exactly at the moment that I went through the door of the Dorchester and somebody said, Kennedy's been shot. I think that must have been about 7 o'clock.
I, with a lot of colleagues from BBC and ITV, was at the Dorchester Hotel, and Reggie Bosanquet came straight towards me. I looked at him and said, Reggie, what on earth's the matter? And he said, Kennedy has been shot, and I think he's dead. And it was like a hot knife going through you. It was unbelievable. And of course, the news spread like wildfire around the room, and what should have been a happy awards ceremony evening turned into almost a wake. And then Geoffrey Cox, the then editor of ITN, looked across at me and said, come on, Andrew, I think we ought to go back to the shop. And that's what we did.
There were just 2 channels, BBC and ITV. And on both, hugely popular programmes were scheduled.
The BBC had made an ass of himself on this particular night because they had gone off the air immediately. And when I saw they were off the air, I said, we can't go on with emergency war. They're off the air, you see. They saw us still on the air, so they put back Harry Worth. We went off, and they were stuck. They couldn't go off again. Everyone's gone on and brought their program back. So they got a lot of bad criticism the next day.
I went back, first of all, to the television centre to see what was happening there, and a lot of people were drunk in the gallery, I remember. They were all very emotional. I remember Grace Wyndham Goldie, who was probably more drunk than the others, saying, "News has let us down, news has let us down," and she kept saying.
Newspapers had not yet been upstaged in handling breaking stories by satellite television. With their soon-to-be outdated technology, each paper was determined, like the Daily Express, then based in the heart of Fleet Street, to give the best coverage of the Dallas tragedy.
I went to the foreign desk and I found a scene of amazing confusion and tension. Now, I had given up smoking that day. I gave up smoking fairly frequently. So at the moment that I heard that Kennedy was dead, I took off my coat and I sent my secretary out for 3 packets of cigarettes.
It really did hit me that we were tackling one of the big stories of the century, and totally unexpected, which to a newspaper man is, you'll not misunderstand me, the best kind of story, like the Titanic. Totally unexpected, dramatic. And we had to do it better than all the other papers. And if we didn't, I knew I'd hear from Lord Beetlebrook. And then the whole enormous process of producing the paper began.
Ross Mark, our Washington correspondent, going on shooting bear in the mountains. And Rennie McCall, who was our chief foreign correspondent, was in Central America. So I was then left with George Gale, who was a great colour writer. But George was spending his day off, mostly in Elvino. And I had Gale brought back to the office. And it became obvious to me that Gale was not really in the right spirit to write 1,000 words about the tragedy of John Kennedy. And I went to see him about 15 minutes later, and his head was in his typewriter, and around him were about a dozen sheets of paper, each of which contained half a sentence. So I thought, my God, it's up to me. And I then got on my typewriter, opened the cigarettes, and wrote the leader page.
8, 7, 6.
Right, stand by, everyone.
Television news had few of today's resources,
2 grams and take it.
but plenty of adrenaline.
I went on to do the 9 o'clock news with about half an hour's warning. And of course, the news was breaking all the time. It was a moment of great tension, great excitement in the news sense. And then did several news flashes for the network after that, right through to a close down, which I think in those days was about 11:45.
Well, it seemed to be an incredible moment to everybody, because I've never known anybody that affected people so much as Kennedy. Everybody remembers where they were at that time. You ask somebody, where were you when Kennedy was shot? And they all remember. It's an amazing moment in history.
I was on my way home from the studios at Lion Grove, and I had the wireless on, and I heard this announcement, which was breaking into whatever program was on, that he'd been shot. And I remember as I heard those words, I said aloud, I was quite alone in the car, I said aloud, "Oh no, oh no."
I was with my ex-wife in a West End cinema when I became aware of something going on behind me, and I turned round and I could see people in the back row of the balcony chatting busily to each other and then talking to the people in the row in front of them. And I guessed something pretty dreadful had happened. And you know the way today at football matches people create the human wave, you know, which moves along the stadium. Well, in the same way, this ripple came down the balcony towards us. And eventually I said to the man behind me, "What's happened?" And he said, "Kennedy's being assassinated."
That Friday afternoon, I'd finished teaching about 4 o'clock. And I thought between 4 and 6, I'd take some of the cadets shooting on the range. So we went up with at least 4, if not 8 cadets, and the captain is shooting, a young chap called Cameron Kennedy. And against all the rules, I asked him if he would lock up. So I gave him the armory keys, the magazine keys, and he had the weapons and the ammunition. And I left because the next day was Saturday, there was going to be a film, and so I thought I'll thread up the first spool now. Suddenly, one of the auditorium doors opened, light flooded in, a smallish boy standing there in silhouette, shouting, "Sir, sir, Kennedy's been shot." With that, he disappeared, and I switched off the light, and I set off rather slowly. Could have been thinking about alibis, I suppose. Set off slowly for the sort of matron's area of the school, and I didn't like to ask her directly, so I said, "Matron, is there anything that I ought to know?" And she said, "Yes, President Kennedy's been shot." Whereupon the weight was off me. I'd got my job back, and I was extremely happy.
This birthday party was being planned because it was my birthday, and we were on the phone. Do we call the party off? People, no, and people really wanted to get together. That was the thing, because everybody wanted to share this thing, because nobody could handle it on their own. That was what was so strange. And again, I think this is something that nobody can appreciate now unless you were there. And so eventually the party happens, and then we just danced and got drunk and fell about and cried and watched the television, and went on and on and on. And it was almost like a Greek funeral. It was that almost pagan.
I was in the bar of that Rediffusion Television used in Television House in Kingsway. The telephone rang. It was a colleague who directed this week telling me that Kennedy had been shot, and he was coming in because we would want to do a program, and nobody ever doubted that we should immediately do a program.
So we had to go around, try to get as many people as we could. We tried everybody. Most people were out of town. Anyway, we finally managed to get 3 Americans: Carl Foreman, the film producer, a man called John Crosby, and an actor called Eli Wallet.
We found that the BBC had grabbed Alec Douglas Hume and Harold Wilson, and we had to make other arrangements, and we hauled George Brown, who was then deputy leader of the Labour Party, out of a party dinner. It was quite well into the evening by the time we got hold of him, and it was a bit later than that by the time he came into the studio at about 10:30.
In the hospitality room, Brown had obviously drunk too much. He was pretty drunk. When Wallach was introduced to Brown, Brown said, "I'm a great admirer of yours." Wallach said, "Thank you very much." And then he said, "Yes, I've always..." And he kept talking to Wallach. Wallach was interested talking to him. He went over and took a drink. Brown kept shouting at him, and he said, "Have you ever been in a play by Ted Willis?" And Wallach said, "No, who's Ted Willis?" And Brown said, "You don't know who Ted Willis is?" Ted Willis was the author of Dixon and Dock Green, you see. "You don't know who Ted Willis is?" And Willis was a great labor supporter. "No, I don't know." He said, "That's the trouble with you actors. You're all so bloody conceited."
I was in and out between the green room and the studio. I wasn't aware that there'd been any great hoo-ha of any sort. I thought the atmosphere in the green room was a bit strange, but I put that down to the fact that people were grief-stricken.
Walt listened to a time. Finally, he took his jacket off and he said, "I'm going to knock the can off you. Get off that seat." Brown, rather surprised, sort of looked at him and said, "Oh, shut up, shut up." He said, "Come on, get up." He leaped at him. I jumped in between the two of them to try and separate them. Here's the deputy leader of the Labour Party and an actor tussling on the night Kennedy was shot. About 10 minutes later, Brown got on the program, was interviewed, the hysteria, the drink, and everything else, and he made a mess of the occasion. He was very much criticized, and his chances of becoming leader of the Labour Party were ended on that night.
It was evening, late in the evening after the supper, and my father, he's sitting with his papers which he brought from the office, and then it was next room, it was telephone call, and it was the foreign minister Andrei Gromyko, and he called it. It was some informations which they received from the broadcasting that was something happened in Dallas with President Kennedy, or he wounded, or somebody tried to shoot him, or he killed, or something. And my father was very very nervous, not only because it was the President Kennedy, but because if it is something happened in the other country, it can mean everything, including the war. And so he asked him to call to the ambassador and to find what's really happened, or it is true or not. And so he did not come back to his papers. He was in that room with the telephone. It was small, round table in the middle, and he walked around there 1 minute, another minute, 5 minutes. It was no call, and then he picked up the telephone. Until now, it is the official confirmation from the White House that the president died.
Kennedy's press secretary was not at his side that day, but en route to Japan to organize a future presidential trip.
We took off at 6 a.m. from Honolulu Airport for Tokyo. We were out about 3 hours when suddenly somebody grabbed me and took me into the lounge. Remember, this was a presidential plane. And there were sitting the 6 cabinet members, and suddenly I looked at their eyes. Something was really terrible. And they handed me a wire that had just come out saying JFK has been shot. And they asked me to set up the telephone system to the White House. We had a very special system in that plane. The plane turned 180 degrees around, started back towards Honolulu. I got through to the White House. It was total confusion. I couldn't really find out what was going on. And this went on and on and on until about a half hour later, suddenly I hear a shout in my ear, "Wayside, stand by." Wayside was my code name. And then every 30 seconds for almost 5 minutes, "Wayside, stand by, Wayside, stand by." And then Wayside, "Lancer is dead." Lancer was the code name of JFK. I was crushed. I just, I mean, for me, it was the saddest moment of my life.
Good evening. Well, as the whole world now knows, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 34th President of the United States, is dead. He was shot near...
At 11 o'clock, a Granada special for viewers in the north.
It started off with Grundy telling the audience all he could about what had happened, and he even was able to disclose the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald had been identified, and it wasn't known whether he had actually killed Kennedy, but certainly had been identified and was subsequently arrested.
When the press got to meet Oswald, the self-styled Liverpool Echo reporter John Peel was there.
They brought Lee Harvey Oswald in, and I suppose he was about sort of 5-6 feet away from me. And either he didn't know what was going on, or he's a very good actor. I mean, he just looked kind of, "Come on, guys, you know, this has gone too far. You know, is this a joke or what?" And he had a big bruise on his cheek, I remember. And you know, he was standing. I was standing over there watching him. And Henry Wade said something like, "You know, this is the man who's been charged with the assassination of President Kennedy." And general excitement, and then he was led away again. And as I say, I've told this story so many times that I didn't really believe it myself. But then I was round at Andy Kershaw's a couple of years ago, and he'd got one of those TV documentaries about it, and they were showing this film of the whole proceedings. I mean, they'd put the film on to demonstrate the fact that Jack Ruby was in the room as well, which I hadn't known until I'd seen this film. But in the last few frames, there's me and my mate Bob standing there just watching, you know. So it was true, and I was rather startled, to be honest, to see the truth of it demonstrated.
The newspapers of the world, of course, are full of the news. We have a little film now of the newspapers, and then Mike Scott will be showing you those that have come into this studio.
We've already got tomorrow's newspapers. Judging by this film, so have a lot of other people. They all have the same sad tale to tell. Daily Express, Kennedy is dead, car ambushed.
Finally, I, by that time, had all the details in the newspapers and read to camera the various headlines from the newspapers. And my last moment was strange in a way, because in some ways I looked as if I smiled, but when I looked at myself 30 years later, I realized that smile was a smile which was close to tears.
Threw her arms round him and cried, "Oh no." I don't think there's anything more to say from tomorrow's papers.
The advert promised a new body. The fortune teller said he'd be a tall, dark stranger. man promised sun. The decorators said they'd be finished on time. The children promised that they'd be good. And her stars, that today would be her lucky day. But not all promises are broken. At Tesco, we promise the tenderest beef, the freshest bread, and the finest fruit. And that's a cast-iron quality guarantee. Tesco, every little helps.
Can you tell the difference between surf and higher-priced liquids? Put it to the test on stubborn stains like ketchup, gravy, and butter. No liquid cleans better than surf because it's got all the stain digesters of other liquids. Look, no difference at all. Except it costs you less. That's the surf difference. And if you're not completely satisfied, we'll give you your money back. Surf. Tackles stains, cuts costs.
What can I get my grandson? Jack loves surprises. I'm going to get Joanna something she's wanted for absolutely ages.
She's always in the bathroom, my sister, just like me.
Love it.
Who cares that you find just the right present? Boots. We care because you do.
I fancy some beef. If I could take that grill out, I could do a cracking steak on it. Oh yeah, big juicy sirloin, all marinated and garlicky. Look at it just sizzling away there. That's enough that side. Oh, that beef looks well tender. It's gonna melt in the mouth, that is. A few herbs. Just doing me time.
British beef. Even the thought of it tastes good. Over 4 million smokers worldwide have used Nicotinell, the 24-hour nicotine patch program that gradually weans you off your craving for cigarettes. If you're determined to give up, it needn't be held with Nicotinell.
Well, what do you think, Jeeves?
Sir?
Our new cooler whatnot?
May I inquire what you're proposing to do with it?
It's for the jolly old Croft original.
If I might caution you, sir.
A drop of the chilled Croft is absolute nectar. Everyone at Stiffy Bings do lapped it up. The trouble with you, Jeeves, is that you're too stuck in your ways.
But not quite in the Ice Age, it would just.
Chilled Craft Original. One instinctively knows when something is right.
JFK was dead, and for one moment, the news stopped the world. No leader had the same hold on us before or since. A politician had gone, yet it felt like a death in the family. The world had never felt that way before, because Kennedy occupied a unique place in our history. His was the first generation of world leaders with the power to destroy the planet, but whose promise to improve it was credible. And in the few short years of his presidency, JFK took us close to both extremes. Our hearts and minds went with him. In '61, Cuba's Marxist leader, Fidel Castro, had defeated an American-backed invasion, humiliating Kennedy. In '62, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, Cuba's backer, became convinced America would try again. Warships carrying missiles were dispatched. Superpower confronted superpower.
Well, the atmosphere was little short of electric, because here were these ships coming across the Atlantic bearing missiles, and Kennedy had said that they come so far and no further, must turn around. And Khrushchev had said they wouldn't, and Kennedy said they will, and the abyss was opening up before us.
I mean, there was real fear in the air, and people, I mean, really, really serious and intelligent people were having what they were convinced was their last drink. It was a farewell drink, and it was quite frightening.
My feelings were mirrored exactly by the feelings I felt as a little boy when I heard Mr. Chamberlain announce World War II.
And I was 6 at the time, and I thought this meant that the door would open and the Nazis would march in and take us away. A real terror. And that's exactly how I felt when the brink came.
And we were in Germany when Kennedy actually said to him, you know, if you don't stop or turn around by 12 o'clock, it's good night, God bless your brown bread. And I thought, God bless him. He's got Khrushchev. We're going to win this. And when he did, I was very proud of Kennedy.
It was the Soviet leader who blinked. The ships turned back. Khrushchev's son, Sergei, believes the legacy of the crisis was a new understanding between the two leaders.
During the Cuban Missiles crisis, my father, I think like a President Kennedy, he realized, I don't know, understood, maybe better to say he feel, that now they can find solution to the preventing the war, to save the world. Because both of them found it during the crisis how to escape from the war, and they found the solution.
When it passed, I think the relief was so enormous, and we felt we had a man who could keep us safe and well for generations to come.
Kennedy symbolized new hopes as well as unprecedented fears. The media image of the young Kennedy seemed to match the aspirations of early 60s Britain. The Tories had won an election on the slogan, "You've never had it so good." Affluence, it seemed, was within everyone's reach, not necessarily through the methods of the great train robbers, who in '63 made off with a then staggering haul of £1 million. An attractive, charismatic American president was a mirror for British optimism.
The chassis of that king of cars, the Rolls-Royce, 8-cylinder, 6-litre, all for a little under £9,000. Work hard and it could be yours too.
There was a time of almost full employment, so there was more money, and those who had money, it did go further. We could live more comfortably and more easily. And I say, as a father with small children, I did feel that they had the prospects of a much better life ahead. And I saw the symbol of that hope in JFK.
Then suddenly, on that November night, the news that seemed almost beyond belief. The symbol was gone.
I was working at the London Palladium at the time, and I'd worked with the comedian Arthur Haynes. I was his straight man. I can just say I was devastated. You know, I had to pull my socks up and go on for the finale, and I just went through it automatically.
Streets throughout the country were stunned by the news from Dallas.
I was in the New Theatre Hotel, which was a pub near Granada Television, and I was having a drink, and I remember very, very clearly, it was as if someone had turned off the sound effect marked Northern pub atmosphere. Suddenly there was no sound, and you went, what happened? And somebody said, Kennedy's been shot.
Chris Sanford had joined Coronation Street as Walter Potts, a window cleaner in search of pop stardom.
Oh, not too little, not too much. He was a sort of, if you like, a mild send-up of what was happening in pop music at that time. So we had this strange phenomena where we actually made the record in real life, and it was released in the storyline as well. And the two records, the storyline record and the real record, went up the charts together.
Hey, not too little, not too much. You've got a perfect love and touch. Not too little, not too much.
And Walter's great moment, on stage with the new superheroes from Merseyside. But love, or sex at any rate, could be bad for some in that year of '63. John Profumo, War Minister in Harold Macmillan's government, was forced to resign after he lied to Parliament about his affair with call girl Christine Keeler. Society osteopath Stephen Ward was the link between the establishment and the oldest profession.
And then there was this wonderful collection of tarts. You see, there was Mandy Rice Davis, who was a very sort of pert little creature. And then Christine Keeler, who was a Mandy's colleague, but not of the same caliber. But she was very sexually attractive. I mean, we couldn't deny that.
Ward became the scapegoat of the establishment. He was put on trial, then committed suicide. Another twist to the story pursued avidly by the press and relished by the British public.
The whole case obsessed this country. It indirectly, I think, led to the fall of the Macmillan government. I mean, it was very soon after that they had to pack it in.
But the American public never read about the sex scandals in their own government. The president's wholesome, clean-cut media image was false.
In many respects, his private personality was very different from the public figure. He was a compulsive womanizer. They used to call him in Washington in those days Jack the Zipper.
I can't say I was disillusioned when I heard about all that, about all his womanizing, but I was slightly surprised because it seemed to be so enormous. I mean, you know, a whole collection of different women and at different times of the day and in his own bed in the White House and all over the place. I mean, he was a great bonker. He was one of the world's great bonkers.
I did, in fact, know that Kennedy was rather involved with women and that there was a sort of sexual aspect of his career. And I often wondered to myself how soon this would get out.
Nobody ever spoke about it. It was quite interesting. I mean, I think quite a lot of the American correspondents didn't know about it. I mean, they may have had rumors, but nobody had anything concrete. And what they did have, it was at that time not considered proper to use of the head of state. Quite interesting. You couldn't do that now.
Only one time when I was in this White House did a journalist come to me in my office, which was just down here, and he said to me, "I'm getting information that JFK's got some mistresses." I gave him my 1960s answer. I couldn't get away with it in 1993. I said, "Listen, he's the President of the United States. He's got to work 15, 16 hours a day. He's got to take care of foreign policy and domestic policy. Now, if he's got time for mistresses after that, what the hell difference does it make?" The guy laughed, walked out. That was the end of the story.
I mean, I was a journalist after all this. I never considered for a moment making a public issue of this knowledge I had from private sources. I mean, journalists were gentlemen in those days.
He was a man who made mistakes. He was a man who made serious and important successes. And that's how you look at a president. But I think the major thing that he did in his presidency was to save the world from nuclear war. I mean, when the Cuban Missile Crisis, and now people understand how close we were to nuclear war and how President Kennedy solved that problem, I think that's something that is high on the list of legacy of President Kennedy.
Kennedy was the Lochinvar, the Galahad. He was to most people who live now don't realize the tremendous impact this good-looking, youthful person. He'd only been president, I think, for 2 years or something of that kind.
We were always surrounded by very elderly statesmen who seemed to be too old to be alive, let alone running countries. But he was a man that even us fellows who were younger than him could see was a sort of young buck with all the kind of power and confidence of the most important nation in the world. And everything seemed to rest on his shoulders, and we had tremendous hopes for him.
Kennedy, in some ways, was seen as a symbol, not just of a new America, but of a new world. He was a young man. He was good-looking, a sort of mixture of Robert Redford and Steve McQueen. And I think people felt when he took over that the world had a new chance, and America had a sort of leader which would enable it to lead us forward into a better future rather than simply keep things under control.
Dennis Healey, a seasoned politician even then, was not immune to the widespread sense of loss.
The thing I remember very well indeed was sitting at home in Highgate in London and just hearing this terrible news on the radio, and I burst into tears.
I was horrified because I knew John F. Kennedy and thought very well of him. And it seemed to me, as it seemed to many people, that a light had gone out in the world.
As a political correspondent in America, Keith Kyle had got to know Kennedy before he became president.
I was anxious to know what sort of impression he would make. and he asked me out to lunch and drove me into the countryside in his car. It was a most alarming journey because Kennedy engages one in conversation very intensely. He has an extraordinary ability to extract from you anything that is worth knowing about a subject in a relatively short compass of time. He makes a splendid television interviewer. And throughout this drive, he was looking at me full in the face, never once putting his eyes on the road, and he drove very fast.
In 1960, when I first arrived in Dallas, or hadn't been there very long, of course there was the election, and they had the parades on consecutive days, and that car came to a complete standstill, so I ran out and shook hands with him and said something like, "Good luck, Mr. Kennedy." And he said, and it does sound so implausible, I'm almost embarrassed to tell you, because people think, oh, come on, you know. But he said something like, "You're from England, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, you know, what are you doing here?" And so I said, "Oh, I just came over, you know, for a few months to learn about the cotton industry." And so we had a bit of a chat, and of course you don't really know. I didn't know whether it was like a couple of minutes or 30 seconds or whatever. For a politician, I'd have thought this was probably unique. I mean, he talked about me rather than about himself, you know, because he seemed to be genuinely interested in what I was doing for a short period of time. So, obviously, after that, I wanted him to win the election so I could say, well, that's my mate John, you know, he's the President of the United States now.
He's so fine. Wish you were mine.
Kennedy brought glamour to the political stage, a place where people were not accustomed to finding it. And television had not previously found, on either side of the Atlantic, so telegenic a politician. As Lime Grove crumbles, Sir Paul Fox, who once ran BBC Current Affairs here, recalls the presidential magic.
He had a charmed relationship with the media. I mean, there's no question of that. The media adored him because he knew how to deal with the media. He attracted the media, he attracted media people, and he was an impressive figure on television. I always remember he was over here on a visit to see Prime Minister Macmillan. Macmillan, after all, was a kinsman. He always called him Uncle Harold. I remember he was here, and it was the night of a panorama program. And I asked Ludo Kennedy to go and interview him. And Ludo did a most marvelous doorstepping job on President Kennedy.
I rushed towards him, and I saw the Secret Service people. So I thought, I wondered if they were reaching for a gun or something, because I just came out of the blue like that.
It wouldn't have been possible that any previous president, or presidents afterward, could have been successfully doorstepped. And what's more, President Kennedy recognized Ludo and said, "Oh, I've just read your book about Notting Hill Gate."
Well, that was astonishing, you see. He didn't know I was coming. I mean, you can brief a president. You would say, oh, so-and-so's coming along, ask him, say that you know about this. He didn't know I was coming at all. And that was, of course, was very impressive.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Remember, the television at that time was not the powerful force it is today. But I did something after President Kennedy was elected that changed things in the direction of television by convincing him that he should have live television press conferences, something that had never happened with any president before.
Their duty, and then they're called back. And
there was a real charisma. He had a sense of humor. We now know that this image of him as being very young and fit was quite phony. He was actually extremely seriously ill in several ways. But he used to stand up and take questions at these press conferences. It was a performance. He was stylish. He was funny.
How is your aching back? It depends on the weather, political and otherwise.
The reporters who made the Kennedy reputation were also Harvard men and Yale men, and they got on like a house on fire with the Kennedy people, and they were very uncritical, actually. To be fair, I think a lot of these people now realize that they were seduced and sort of had by the excitement and the charm of the Kennedy coterie. But there was an enormous amount of uncritical journalism.
There are many Americans who believe that in our manner of questioning or seeking your attention, that we're subjecting you to some abuse or a lack of respect.
Well, you're subject me to some abuse, but not to any lack of respect, I don't think.
Thank you, Mr. President.
When the Black Watch played on the White House lawn on November the 13th, JFK had 9 days to live.
Well, it was a historic occasion for my regiment. I think the last time that we had been in the White House was when we burnt it down in 1812, as a matter of interest, or so my pipe major told me. We thought it'd be a nice gesture on behalf of the regiment if we could make a presentation to the president. So I made a very short speech in front of him before the performance of the bands. And we gave him one of our big regimental dirks with the regimental motto inscribed on it, which in the circumstances, with hindsight, of course, is slightly ironic.
I want to thank Major for this presentation of the Dirk of the Black Watch. The Major just said that the motto of the Black Watch is, nobody wounds us with impunity. I think that's a very good motto for some of the rest of us. Thank you.
Fort Worth, Texas, on the last morning of Jack Kennedy's life. About him, as ever, the aura that made people talk of a new world Camelot, the charm and the wit.
2 years ago, I said that, introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting that same sensation as I travel around Texas. Nobody wonders what Lyndon and I wear.
And so to Dallas, and the shots that were to kill a president and stun the world.
Right, Atkins, let's get cracking.
Cracking, JD. Hello, Mrs. D.
Hello.
New Astra Ethos, I see.
All part of JD's economy drive. What with a thingy?
E-Drive, the Astra's most economical petrol engine.
Saves me a fortune. Caviar, champagne, truffles, fresh lobster, venison, smoked salmon.
Ming vase?
Don't be silly, JD. That's mulligatawny soup. The Ming vase is in here.
It's remarkable how much money the Astra Ethos saves you, JD.
Duracell is no ordinary battery. In continuous tests, it lasts up to 6 times longer than ordinary SP batteries. Duracell. No ordinary battery looks like it or lasts like it.
That's it. I took O'Brien's advice on the 7th horse in the accumulator, and in it came 7th. But like my Murphys, I'm not bitter. Especially as I had a side bet on the St. Barnabas steeplechase.
It's twirl time.
I'm going to go into this cafe here, just stop them and tempt them with the Cadbury's twirl. You're very keen. How's that? I'm going to tempt you with the twirl. Is that lovely? So you can just get on with your day now. And, oh, excellent. I must just congratulate you on your hairdo. Fine set of sideburns. I very much appreciate them.
Kellogg's Crunchy Nut Cornflakes. Golden flakes encrusted with honey, nuts, and brown sugar. Kellogg's Crunchy Nut Cornflakes. The trouble is, they taste too good.
Give your family a Christmas they'll never forget. Give them Sky. With over 20 satellite channels, you can give them top sporting action. England's tour of the West Indies, Lewis on the warpath, and the Premier League exclusively live. 3 channels of blockbuster movies.
I am Catwoman. Ooh.
and great family entertainment. There's something for everyone. So get Sky now and give your family a Christmas they'll never forget.
Washington, on the night of November the 22nd, 1963.
Finally, we arrived at the White House, and we had a prayer session. And then Jackie said, why don't you spend the night here at the White House? This has been a tough day for you. I had never spent the night in the White House. So I went upstairs, and there was Larry O'Brien, Ken O'Donnell. We talked till about 5 o'clock in the morning. Finally, I went to sleep. And suddenly, at 7 o'clock, the phone next to me rings, and the secretary is saying, the president wants to talk to you. The first thing that comes into my brain, oh my God, I've just had a terrible nightmare. And then I hear this voice saying, oh, Pierre, this is Lyndon. And I suddenly knew for sure that JFK was dead.
At the United States Embassy in London, on the morning of November the 23rd, a steady stream of visitors come to pay their respects. A stream that feeds a river of mourning worldwide.
In the period immediately after President Kennedy's death, Mrs. Kennedy received over 3 million expressions of sympathy and condolence from people around the country and around the world. These were in the form of letters, of spiritual bouquets and mass cards, and those, a very substantial number came from Britain, which was one of the countries which produced the largest spontaneous response to President Kennedy's death. Mrs. Kennedy received approximately 500,000 letters from people in the United Kingdom. A lady from London wrote, Dear Mrs. Kennedy, I hesitated writing at once, as of course you will be inundated with messages, and anyway, there are no words at all. I am still wondering if I shall wake up and find that it was a bad dream. It's so impossible to believe.
Well, when I got a quiet moment, I thought I must write to that poor girl. Let her know that the whole world is looking and watching to hear some, at least small comfort for her. She had to have the love of everybody. It was only that was going to pull her through. You can have all the money in the world. They were a wealthy family. But you still need people. It's the feeling of others and the letting of you know that those people are there, feeling for you. That's what brings you through these things.
Dear Mrs. Kennedy, I am writing on behalf of the staff and pupils of St. Augustine's Secondary School on the tragic and untimely death of your husband, President J.F. Kennedy. We have followed with great excitement his fresh, youthful, and wise approach.
Your dear husband will surely go down in history as the greatest man of our time. His steady toils for peace, his wonderful stand over Cuba, and above all, his Civil Rights Bill. Indeed, we have lost a good friend. He will long be remembered with love and respect.
Merseyside showed its respect in its own way. At Everton's ground, as at others on the day after Kennedy's death, a minute's silence before the game.
I think a lot of people were so horrified by what had happened that they were glad to be able to take part in some form of tribute. And I was over there in the Bullens Road stand, and the silence started, and it was almost, well, it was absolute. Couldn't even hear the traffic outside.
I've been watching Everton since I was about 8 years of age. I remember that day when they had the minute silence, a minute or 2 minutes silence. There wasn't a sound anyway. The bus was behind, couldn't hear a thing, and you know, it was just total silence. And next thing, this bloke jumps up, punches the air, shouts, "Long live Khrushchev." Next minute, it seemed to go in slow motion. Bloke hit him the back of the neck. He seemed to go down in slow motion. You know. and they were punching him, pushing each other away to punch him. And then they seemed to make a pathway for the policeman to come along there, and the policeman, he just jumped over and lifted him over that wall there. I don't know, it's just a funny thing. It's just one of those things where it sticks in your mind. It sticks in your mind.
That was the week that was over.
That was the week that was. For many viewers, the unmissable weekend show. Irreverent, provocative, funny. Its producer knew that this edition called for something else.
We were not doing a judgment on Kennedy. We were trying to reflect what immediately was the national feeling, and indeed it turned out, though we couldn't know that at the time, the international feeling that a light had gone out. When a light has gone out, you don't do an investigative report on the quality of the fuel.
A young man rode with his head held high under the Texas sun.
Ned stood me almost in silhouette. There's very little of me that shows, because I said, if I start to cry, I don't want that on the screen because I don't think it looks right.
Lord, he so goes riding on.
I always remember seeing that little tear, one tear coming down one side of the face, which I suppose symbolized the shock that most people felt at the time.
I thought it was, I'm very proud of that piece of music. I thought they did a wonderful job, and it was, I wish I didn't have to have sung it, but it was wonderful to do it.
At BOAC, some senior flight personnel were contacted urgently.
So I gave operations a ring, and I was told that I had to go out on a trip the following day. When I asked where to, they said, sorry, can't tell you. Well, where am I going? Sorry, can't tell you. Well, how long am I going away for? I can't tell you. Well, you try telling a wife that you're going away. You don't know where to and how long for. It's not an easy question, but she was very understanding. Following day, I arrived at the airport, and I met the flight manager, who then informed me the circumstances. That we were to take the Duke of Edinburgh, the Prime Minister, Sir Alec Douglas-Hume, plus certain high officials from the Foreign Office, over to Washington for the funeral of President Kennedy. It could be described best as tense, because having lost one of the world's great leaders, I think it affected everybody. And obviously governments were wondering what was going to happen in the light of the assassination.
Royalty, heads of state, many of them much older than the murdered president, and thousands of ordinary mourners converged on Washington. John Kennedy had had just over 1,000 days to make his mark on history.
He made the American people feel responsible for the disadvantaged, the poor, the blacks, the people who were regarded as problem people in the previous system, but he made them feel that the American people were responsible for those who weren't as well off as they were.
As the first bitter pangs of our incredulous grief begins to pass, we must thank God that we were privileged, however briefly, to have had this great man for our president, for he has now taken his place among the great figures of world history.
Mrs. Kennedy asked me to send some pipers up to play the cortege from the White House to the cathedral.
It had been just 12 days since the Black Watch played on the White House lawn.
She knew that JFK had enjoyed the performance so much, and the children, that she would wish some recognition of that occasion at the funeral.
Family life plays a big part in everybody's life at some stage. It has to. And their time was then. I wonder how she felt inside. She must have been all torn apart.
John F. Kennedy seemed young, he looked good, he did the right things, he seemed to say the right things, he had a beautiful looking wife. And I think that's what the shock was. He was so young, and you felt he was one of the gang, really. Then suddenly he was taken away. And I think that's why I was in sort of shock. He was such a young lad.
Kennedy was so invincible, we thought, and the man who was going to defend the free world against all enemies, and there was a sort of air of optimism and strength and confidence everywhere, and it was just a shattering thought. You thought anything terrible is now possible.